Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming here tonight. In 2021, I became the chief of the police service. As we've gone into the 2022 calendar year, was the first year it was under the lead of Deputy Paul Hamilton, is that we then started posting our line-by-line use of force interactions. The fact that on a Tuesday evening, a little bit after 6 o'clock, that we can still get people interested in and very mindful of the impacts of our use of force is important. It's absolutely important. It's important because these conversations allow us to review our policies, allow us to review our training, and allow us hopefully to be able to do better and continue to work alongside our community. I'd be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to point out that we have our board chair, John Robertson, here. We have our vice chair, Esther Pauls, here as well. The both deputies and then the team, you'll get to know a lot of them throughout the evening. I also want to acknowledge that in 2024, on November the 9th, you'll see one of the lines in our line-by-line is that officer-involved interaction with Erickson Cabrera. And again, with that, we also have victim services here. We have the ability to pivot into another room if somebody just needs an opportunity to get their breath, to have an opportunity to just find some time. The importance of speaking about Erickson Cabrera is not to be provocative, but it is to be true. That, in fact, that is a conversation that a lot of you have come here to speak about and understand. So let's unpack that. By virtue of legislation, there's a few things I think I want to make sure that I have clarity in the room to understand. The reason the use of force is so important is that the legislation and the government, in many different iterations, in my 43rd year, there's been many different iterations of trying to get a way to tell the story about what is use of force. Most recently, there's been, again, a revision to the use of force wheel. Is when a police officer makes a decision about what impact or what result they'll have with an interaction. The other thing that I've seen in my growth of policing, also is understanding, even in this calendar year, in 2024, I was taken aback by the fact is that 96% of the interactions were citizen-driven. And that's the clarity I also want to bring to the room, that there's assumption as well that we're out there and we're looking, when in fact, as many things, our response is to a community's need, and that's what brings us into it. On November the 9th, and what you want to speak to has already been covered, and we've all read the special investigation report that was brought forward by Director Joe Martino. So I want to be clear, I'm not here to be able to articulate, or I'm not here to discuss the findings of that review. By legislation, in the event of serious injury, death, sexual assault, or officer-engaged shooting, we have an obligation, and we did that obligation in the early afternoon on the 9th of November, and we notified the Special Investigation Unit. The Ministry of the Solicitor General, the Government of Ontario, has very clear guidelines that investigation, and the lead of that investigation is the Special Investigations Unit. So us receiving that report on the 6th of June, where all of you have read it as well, we now have an obligation, and the clock has already started. We have 90 days to return a response of the investigation back to our board. That board then has an obligation to post it publicly to make sure that that community can understand it. We have yet to receive any materials from that investigation. We do not know the interview results. We do not know the citizens, the witnesses, the involved officers' statements. We do not have any indications or any things that speaks about the materials, about evidence, and about other things that were collected on that 5th floor. So for me to speak at this juncture about that would be wrong. It'd also be wrong for us to make assumptions and not remember the profound impact that that interaction had on Erickson's family, on the Rwandan community, on the community at large, as well as my membership. So I just want that to be clear. So what we will be doing tonight is making sure that we have that opportunity. Now I will be corrected, so I apologize, Darren and Daniel and all that. But last year we talked about 209,000 interactions in 2023, when we talked about 2023 in 2024. Tonight, when we're talking about 2024 in 2025, is that if I'm not completely accurate on this, I apologize. We've had over 672 interactions with the public. That resulted in 303 use of force interactions. We also had a year in 2024, and I remind you that we had a huge spike in shootings. And what that also represented in those interactions, there was a 39% growth into our response to shootings in the calendar year. Shootings response also has a different response from our police agency, from our police service, from our police members. I'm confident you've read the report. I'm confident you've already seen what we're doing. I want to thank the board and their for courage, because we're also telling you the data before we have publicly released it and before it's been received by our police service board. And it's that courage and that necessary opportunity for us to stand in front of you to have these difficult conversations. So tonight, let's go through the line-by-line understanding. Let's go through the conversation that will be the use of force review. It'll go over, and Darren Murphy will be leading that. Daniel and the team and the support team will also have a component tonight to speak about the race identity data, race identity-based data. Kojo, you're here. Kojo, you delegated eloquently to our board. You have questioned the Anti-Racism Act that spoke about police's perception of race. And you questioned where in any world would it be important that what did the cop think the person looked like? So we've had those conversations. We struggled at the board, but at the end of the day, we are held to legislation. At the end of the day, the Hamilton Police Service, the Chief of Police, the board, is held to the language within the legislation that dictates what we will do. But it's the conversations that are occurring in Hamilton that have been leadership conversations, because they're allowing us in the province of Ontario to be leading the conversation about race and identity-based data. A lot of people are meeting, they're struggling with what does that look like. I got to tell you, we have members here tonight, and I believe we have also a agenda room tonight to hear from our community advising panel. And some of them are here. Some of them have participated in our use of force. Some of them have sat on parade. Some of them have done ride-alongs. So this is an opportunity in Hamilton to celebrate the fact that we are having difficult conversations. So I thank you. I thank you for allowing us that ability to have a conversation. So let's unpack this. Let's start going through this. And when we can, we'll give you the opportunity to have a voice, to participate, and allow us to shift into that. Am I turning it over to Carolyn?
Sir.
Thank you for coming out tonight. It is important, and we appreciate it.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming tonight. My name is Carolyn Rashford, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer. This evening marks our third town hall where we share the use of force support with our community. Tonight, we will also include an update on our race and identity-based data strategy, as the Chief was already mentioning. We have a number of presenters, including members from our RIBD Community Advisory Committee, who have joined us tonight and will share their perspective. We have scheduled an hour and a half for this session, and we look forward to answering the questions that you have at the end of the presentations. To get us started, I would like to call up Acting Inspector Darren Murphy to start us off with the use of force report.
I'm just going to start with an acknowledgement and apologize. That's okay. Good evening. Hamilton Police Service is situated upon the traditional territories of the Erin, Huron, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with 1:2 and 1 self-governed, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe to share and care for the resource around the Great Lakes. We further acknowledge that this land is covered by between lakes purchased 1792 between the Crown and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Hamilton Police Service honors with gratitude this scarred land which from the time immemorial has been and is home to many Indigenous people from across territorial lines. Today, the city of Hamilton is home to many Indigenous people from across territorial lines, known as North America. We recognize that we must do more to learn about the rich history of this land so that we can better understand our roles as residents, neighborhood partners, and caretakers. The chief spoke about the fact that this report contains curriculum information and help us better understand policing practices and impact our communities. Just want to acknowledge that we do have victim service in here, victim service team. right here. This content may bring up some strong emotions or life experiences. Please let us know if you need any support or anything, as we do have another room outside. Just feel free to come out and one of our team will come to support you. Some housekeeping, we do have the bathroom just when you leave out to your left. There is food outside. Feel free to enjoy in and out. It is a very friendly environment. Thank you everyone for accommodating and switching over to this room, and to the people online, thank you for being patiently waiting. To support respectful and meaningful engagement, here's a few quick reminders. Please silence your phone to minimize distractions. We will start and end on time to respect everyone's schedule. Let's flow on the one mic kind of guidelines. So if one person is speaking, we'll kind of respect that. Participation is encouraged, but passing on is also okay. For people that are online, please use the chat respectfully. You can just send us questions. We are monitored online as well. And confidentiality matters. Take the stories and leave the names. Some of the principles we talk about in our Hamilton Police Service is that we are rooted in sharing values and respect and openness. We are here to listen deeply, value diverse perspective, and learn together without guilt, shame, or blame. No one knows everything, but together we can know a lot. Let's stay open to new ideas, assume positive intent, and ask compassionate questions. We aim to build trust and honest. I thank you for everyone being here today. This is some heavy conversations. Just want you to know that the team, including myself, are here to support you today. I'll call back Inspector Rashford to introduce everyone.
I will now introduce Acting Inspector Darren Murphy for the use of force report.
Hi, thank you for coming and welcome. Again, we're here to be open and transparent about our use of force data. It's important for us to do that. Just a bit of background for myself. I'm the acting inspector in our professional development division, which looks after our training and specifically our use of force training. For myself, I'm a former use of force armor, use of force instructor, master taser instructor, and that's the right reason that I'm here presenting this data. Also looking after the training that we do conduct daily up at the professional development division. So I'm going to present the use of force report, although I don't know if there's much left. The chief did a really good job. I think I can maybe sit down, but then it'll be followed up with the race and identity-based data information, and the team will come through and present all of that information. And we are going to make ourselves available for questions at the end of that. So everybody can hear me? I'm clear enough? Up a little bit more? You can move a little bit closer, that would be great too, right?
Sorry, 1 second. Virtual can't see the screen. Sorry, folks.
It's sharing the screen.
Is it shared now?
It was sharing.
Okay, thank you.
These are the things that are covered off in our use of force report and that we're mandated to cover off. There's 9 basic details. I'm not going to go through the 9 because it'll be covered off as we go through and speak about them. But this is what we're required to report through to our police service board, and we'll be presenting to them next week. But most of the details we've covered off in previous years, and nothing has changed from there. Again, we're bound by the CSPA and some regulations with use of force, weapons, our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and then common law interpretation. It means that it's not law that's written in statute, but just interpreted to be. And one of the best common law interpretations we have is the authority to search a person after arrest. That's just a common authority that we have. It's not written anywhere that we have to do that. But it's a common law principle that we have the authority to search individuals incident to arrest. That's one example of what common law authority means. Again, use of force is bound off the 4 principles. It has to be lawful. There has to be the legal authority to be able to do what we are doing. It has to be proportional, necessary, and reasonable. And de-escalation is prioritized. Every single police officer in every single situation that we're called to always try to de-escalate the situation and bring about a resolution that keeps it from getting worse. And that's at the heart and root of all of our instruction and policing in general. And then we're not authorized for any excessive or unrestricted authority of use of force. And if we are, it is held accountable by the Professional Development Division. This is the Ontario Public Police Interactions Training Aid. This replaced the old use of force model that many officers went through. It is a newer model. It is not it's not a justification for officers to utilize the use of force. It's more of a training aid or an articulation aid that officers use to help and articulate the type of force that they've used against an individual. Important part to that is the Assess Plan Act, and an understanding that we get the information, and we'll cut through some of the statistics, get the information maybe from dispatch or something that we see, we assess it, bring it in, formulate a plan on how we're going to respond, and then we act. And it's important that conflict prevention, bringing it down and de-escalating it, is always at the core of everything that we choose to do. And we are always, and it's not as stationary. Once we've arrived on a position that we want to act upon, we also have to keep reassessing and understanding, has the situation changed? Has the dynamics changed? Has the subject or personality changed? We have to always be going through this Assess Plan Act, and it's a constantly evolving process. Okay, so what, again, coming through some of our use of force, some of our members of our community advisory panel went through, and other members have come through our use of force training. What would precipitate an officer from making decisions? I think one of the understandings of one of the principles under the CSPA is that one of our guiding principles is to protect life, all right, preserve and safety. And it's about protecting the public. It's about protecting ourselves, other police officers, and even the subject themselves. Our decisions to use force is about keeping individuals safe. And it's a person that we're interacting with, and it's important, right? We have the right and the authority to be able to defend, all right? Sometimes just gaining control. Most often, when we're in a situation, our objective is to gain control, to de-escalate, bring forward, bring down, right? We might be effecting a lawful arrest or prevent the continuation of an offense. So all of those things can come into play, but at the top of it, most often, it's usually to protect the public. So just some of the training that kind of goes through. Prior to going to police college or recruit, we'll receive 1 day of use of force training. It's mostly equipment orientation and an understanding of de-escalation. They do get training into mental health crisis response, which is further carried on during OPC. There's 13 more weeks. They do cover the police public interaction model, and they cover off officer safety, defensive tactics, de-escalation. A key element, time, distance, cover. You're going to hear that when we talk about this a little bit later with our de-escalation tactics. They do firearms training, and then when they come back, they do CEW, which is our conducted energy weapon. They do training and course certification on that. We have a 1 week focus on de-escalation, communication, articulation, and a lot of scenario-based judgment. New recruits are now, because of changes to the CSPA, will be getting carbine operator training. And then again, they do get training on report writing that we're talking about today, and the interactions training age. One thing that's come about too is they now come out before they hit the roads. They are receiving crisis intervention training and from mental health professionals. So, and then ongoing training, we get yearly. We do our annual requalification, and one of the elements that we've brought into is our ABLE training, looking at preventing misconduct, reducing mistakes, and then supporting officer wellness. So, just some of the training programs that's going, and it's they just don't receive training once. It is an ongoing process. So it's important to understand one of the things that has really come about with the new online reporting model is when a use of force report is required to be submitted, this is the process that they go through to have it. So an officer will complete a use of force report based on the requirements. It then goes through a supervisor, staff sergeant specifically for review, make sure that the content and the application of force is obviously legal, justified, proportionate, and necessary. It then goes through a commander, so either an inspector or above, who then also then reviews it to make sure that it's legal, proportionate, necessary, and authorized. And then finally, it gets to the use of force sergeant, who then reviews it again and make sure that it meets all those criteria, and then we'll forward it on to the ministry for a final analysis. So there's 4 basic steps that it goes through when a report is completed. So the types of information that is on the use of force report, and again, the form is a government document. It is not a Hamilton Police Service form. It is a government document. We aren't able to, hey, let's add this data, let's pull this data out. It is a government form that we're mandated to fill out in the process, and it's quite strict. For example, if I have drop-down boxes and I don't click one box, it won't let it be submitted and completed correctly. So it is very prescriptive about how it has to be completed. It goes through information, and some of the stuff we're going to be covering off here today, that's a touch screen. I know now not to touch it. Date and time that the force was used, the type of location, all the information about the officer's years of service. It has subject information, we've talked about a little bit later on. Perceived race, it has information regarding age, gender, what the subject was doing that precipitated the use of force, whether they were armed or unarmed, and then the officer's response. The report has evolved over years, allowing more information to be collected and used, which will obviously help us enhance the data that we are retrieving and getting from it. But just the specific force, whether it's CW, it could be a firearm pointed, and then the reason why they resorted to that specific use of force. And then the last section, it deals with injuries and outcomes. It's documented whether there's injuries to the officers, to the subject, whether medical attention was required, and then it goes to the submission to the oversight bodies. Again, we've talked a lot about the race and identity-based data. We are, reporting our perceived race data based on the visual clues that we'll physically have. And again, the RPD group will be talking a lot about them. And it just helps us to assess some of the patterns in use of force. And this is, as far as I know, the only place where we physically are able to collect that data, and it's ministry mandated that we collect that data. So, and it's why we're reporting on it. Okay, again, the race-based data is collected since 2020 for all of Ontario. It captures perception of race and tries to identify any systemic bias in use of force decisions. Again, our race is perceived based on observable features. Could be skin color, hair texture, facial features, accent, dress, surnames, other cues that might give us our own perception of what race the person might be perceived as being, right? We could be getting information from our dispatcher, prior records, and then audio-visual cues or demographics that we're aware of. So just some of the changes that were introduced in 2023, as I kind of talked about. There is expanded data fields. They now expand. Originally, when the report came out online, you were only allowed to report based on 3 individuals. But we're finding that a lot of our calls for service may be dealing with more than 3 individuals. So, the stats and data wasn't completely accurate or correct. So they've expanded it to be an unlimited. So if we are dealing with 5 individuals, we're allowed to, fill in all the information on all of it. Team reporting is introduced. So previously, only tactical teams, public order teams could submit team data. And for example, a frontline patrol officer was to go to a call and 5 different people utilize use of force. 5 different reports would all come in. And sometimes that would skew our data, our use of force data looked much higher. Now, when the enhanced team reporting, if all the officers use similar levels of force, they can submit a team report, and it just helps make our data a little more, accurate or correct. And then a shift in data source. So, for example, they removed some things like soft hand techniques. Most of those never result in any sort of use of force options. So it was like soft hands would just be me handcuffing a non-resistant individual. It doesn't ever resort to use of force. So it was, for example, pull. So they, as much as the report is here, they are taking feedback, evaluations, and they're making changes to it. And we're seeing probably a bit more accurate data coming into it. So again, we're going to be talking about some of our key trends, which basically a lot of you have come here for to talk about. And then we'll follow it up, obviously, with the RVD strategy. And they'll be talking about some of that data at the end. Okay, so just some of our use of force incidents. The chief was pretty close on that. We had 203, 627 public interactions. And a public interaction, just to expand that, is a generated call for service, or CAD, some way we can physically track the interactions that we have. It could be a call from 911 that creates a call for service. It could be a traffic stop. It could be a ride lane. It's something that creates a tangible, measurable interaction. It does that, and our interactions probably actually are a lot higher, but these are just the ones that we can physically track and that are measurable. So again, we've had a bit of a decrease this year from last year in our total interactions with the public, but we'll see that we've got an increase in our use of force. So important here, and I want to screen, we've had 303 use of force incidents, but we've got 317 use of force reports. So when we talk about our use of force data, we are comparing it against use of force incidents. So basically what this equates to is that of our 203, 627 interactions, we used force in 0.15% of the time. That's the heart of it. Again, our reports have gone up to, or down to 317. But again, I'm going to break it down a little bit further. It's largely to do with the ability to utilize team reports, our training, and the officers understanding how a team report works and when it should be submitted effectively. Okay, as mentioned here, what we're seeing as a shift from last year to this year is we're seeing an increase in team reports. Most of our reports are submitted like frontline patrol people. And again, they're recognizing that we can, there's more incidents where a team report can be submitted, and we're seeing individual reports go down. And that is reflective of the training and people now understanding the forms and the process that we're going through. Again, type of use of force reporting and the reporting methods. Again, we are seeing patrol, and we're seeing a lot more team reports by our patrol. And less with our tactical teams, but that's again because of the training and understanding. And again, the forecheck method, where officers are getting, it's going to a supervisor, and a supervisor is kicking back saying, no, it's not an individual report, it's a team report, and then they're doing all those catches and measures, and we're seeing a lot more team reporting. So again, as the chief was mentioning, most 96% of our calls for service or our public interactions that we deal with are created from public calling the police, and then we are in a position where we're required, legislated to respond to that. 4% are created by officers' interactions, which could include a proactive traffic stop or a subject stop on the street, etc. But 96%, and it's pretty consistent over the periods that we kind of looked at, is most of them are publicly generated calls for service. So a lot of slides. I'm going to leave it up here for a couple of seconds for people to start to process. couple things to kind of highlight is our top 3 calls for service that result in use of force being used are weapons offenses. And more significant is a 39% increase in weapons offense calls. We went from 69 in 2023 up to 96 in 2024. Our warrant executions have gone up, which results in a 31% increase over last year, and our person in crisis calls have gone up as well. And those are our 3 main drivers in our calls for service that result in use of force being used. Leave that up there for a couple of seconds for people to process, but we are seeing more weapons related calls. Again, the perception that officers are dealing with where the subject is armed with a weapon, we've seen an increase from 278 last year up to 310 incidents where the subject is perceived to have access to weapons. Again, I'll talk about the total individuals that we interact with, but again, we're seeing a spike in perception of people having access to perception of weapons. And the perception could be information that's fed through dispatch 911, information that comes through. And they say, you know, I see an individual walking down the street with a knife, and then the officers have to physically respond and react. Again, most often, the perceived weapon type is 202 is perceived to be a firearm. The other 28 could be bats, blunt objects, and then the other 54 are perceived to be edged weapons. So we're dealing with 256 weapons that, you know, will trigger a response that we'll cover off in a few slides. Yeah.
Well, if I'm understanding the data correctly, out of 310 suspects, 96 had weapons actually.
96, sorry.
If you, yeah, so
Go back.
2022 is 310 total, and 96 have, they have.
Are perceived, so of this, 96 of the incidents
Actually had the weapon.
are perceived to have. And whether the officers will respond based on what they physically, so there's 96 incidents, 96 calls that we've created where the individual. So when we talk about, these are people that we could have a situation where we go to a call where they are armed with weapons and there's 4 or 5 people we're dealing with. It's not just one for one. We could have one call for service that's created that has 4 or 5 people that could be perceived as access to weapons.
Thanks.
That's good?
Yeah.
Okay. And again, if there's any questions with regards to this afterwards, we'll certainly clean up and clarify for sure. And again, as mentioned, firearms, you know, whether that's a call that's come in and the individual is told 911, the individual is armed with a weapon, a firearm, that still impacts the officer's response. So there's a lot of discussion about de-escalation, and we'll report on a little bit of the techniques, but it's important that de-escalation is understand that it's a process and a desired outcome of what we want to achieve. At every call for service, even if it's not one that requires use of force, we want the situation to remain calm, and we want it to be that way. Important too is that de-escalation, a lot of people think about de-escalation is always the things that I say. And yes, communication is something that we do at every single call. We are always communicating in an attempt to de-escalate, but it can also be our actions. If we have, for example, a person in crisis, sometimes going up and approaching and getting close to a person in crisis is not going to de-escalate, it might escalate. And just having an understanding that it's the words that we say and the things that we do can potentially have the ability to de-escalate a situation. And our goal is obviously to prevent it and prevent it from getting worse. And that's our ultimate goal. And if we can bring it down, and again, most of our interactions with the public, it's 99.85%. The de-escalation, what we do and how we talk, works. It's that 0.15%, which we're all talking about here, where it doesn't work and we end up moving into a use of force situation and scenario. Again, so this kind of goes to what we were kind of talking about here. Within the 303 incidents that we had, use of force incidents, we dealt with 455 people. So again, it's important to realize that on the report, I can capture, you know, if I've got 5, 10, it still captures all those people. So again, we've got 303 incidents of use of force being applied, but we've got 455 people that we've dealt with. Again, on 450 of those calls, the directions to comply were issued. Again, some other de-escalation might have been attempted. Communication and the direction is obviously utilized as a de-escalation tool. Other de-escalation attempts, 367, and then 329 most often complied with the directions that were provided. So of 455, the de-escalation was complied and effective in 329 of those cases. Again, we talk about communication is obviously one of the key components of our de-escalation. The words that we use, how we communicate, and it's stuff that we train in our use of force. You know, we learned a long time ago yelling at individuals doesn't always bring things down. It doesn't help us, you know, communicate more effectively. Again, the use of teamwork. One of the things we stress in use of force training is when we have the ability, we can utilize time, distance, and cover. Because what that does is it changes the officer's ability. If they've got some object between them and an individual who's armed with a knife, it allows them to take a breath, process, plan, assess, plan, and act in a different manner. So again, those are all things that we try to utilize. Again, distance is a huge, whenever we have the ability, although it's not always available. We can't always back up and leave. As I mentioned, one of our primary objectives is to protect the public, and sometimes we have to put ourselves in harm's way in order to make that, and we cannot leave. We cannot leave, but we may end up backing up, finding a, you know, instead of being in a room, can we stand at the doorway to a room? And can we communicate with the person at the doorway where they feel less threatened? And we're able to work on our communication and any of the barriers that we were able to have. It's a huge thing that we stress, and in a lot of our training, and it's been an ongoing thing. Repositioning, again, using containment, just allows officers to breathe, right? So that's the breakdown. Okay, so just the type of fire use of force that is being utilized more frequently. So of our 303 incidents, 321 individuals, a firearm was pointed. Subjects, the firearms was pointed at. So it's important to recognize this here. It may seem a little bit alarming that we're pointing firearms, but it correlates a bit more with the perceived access to having firearms. The 202 incidents that we have, as they increase, I should see a situation where officers are, pointing their firearm more often. If I were to see a situation where, firearms are going up, but officers are not, I'd be asking some questions. We would be looking at some reviews, and is there anything in our training that we need to evaluate for officer safety purposes? Like, why is that happening? So again, against 321 individuals, firearms were pointed. And this correlates with the increase in rise in weapons-related calls for service. So again, we look at our 6-year average for weapons-related calls was 1150, and this year we were up to 1,249 weapons-related calls. So again, firearms pointed, weapons-related calls, they're going up. That's what we're seeing. Again, change in our weapons-related calls. Just an increase, 5.4% change from last year, and an 8.6 over the 6-year average. Again, use of force discharge. This year we saw a decrease discharge from 11 to 8, and 7 were to euthanize animals that were injured. We are seeing a use of force of the CEW, conducted energy weapon, dropping. Again, CEW still in its usage, majority of the time is just being pointed or displayed. Again, but we are utilizing it 48 times as a discharge. It is decreasing. Again, when we're dealing with more firearms, the CEW isn't necessarily an appropriate use of force option, and would not be, if I were to see that going up, it would be something that we would ask ourselves as a training branch, and how is it that we're seeing more CEWs when we're actually seeing more firearms and weapons related calls. Again, physical control against 99, it's a slight increase from 2023. And then again, slight increase in subjects injured, 35 to 36 from 2023 to 2024, and a slight decrease in officers that were injured. Type of injuries, most of the were admitted and treated at a medical facility. Again, could be first aid, no medical treatment. Okay, and then perceived race of the subjects, that up for a little bit. Again, within our use of force, 63% were perceived to be white, 16% perceived to be black, Middle Eastern 8%, East and Southeast Asian 5%, South Asian 4%, Indigenous 2%, and Latino 2%. And again, the RIB team will be discussing that more in depth a little bit later. So just a summary, and I think I'm okay on the timing. Again, we're seeing a decrease in the number of reports that are being submitted because of the expanded team reporting, which is good. It shows that our training and officers are recognizing, and the checks and balances with that are in place. Although our use of force incidents increased 14%, they are in line with what we are seeing and the weapons-related calls that we're seeing and our officers are facing daily on the streets. Again, our weapons-related calls increased by 5%, and they're well above the 6-year average. Again, our use of force incidents remain very rare. Again, 99.85% of the time, no use of force report is required. Just 0.15 of our total interactions result in that use of force. So, yeah, I don't know if we're gonna questions at the end.
We're up to the end. There was a lot of data there.
Okay.
There was a lot, yeah. So, question on team reporting.
Yep.
Can you walk me through, for example, how support individuals are involved in an incident? How does those 4 individual perceptions of an incident relate to one document?
So let's just say, for example, individuals. There is a. I'm going to create a scenario for you that might help paint that.
Sorry, the question for people online.
Just how does a team report? So if we had 4 officers that were dealing with this situation, how does it come about for a team report to be submitted? So I'll paint a scenario. We're dealing with a person in a mental health crisis, armed with a knife, and there's 4 officers that are dealing with that individual. If one officer had a firearm pointed, and the other 3 officers maybe had a CEW, but they were able to de-escalate the situation, and no actual use of force was applied to the individual, they would submit a team report. One person would be indicated that they had a firearm pointed, and then the other 3 would have a CEW pointed. If, for example, CEW was deployed against the individual. The 3 individuals that did not deploy use of force against them would be submitting a team report. And then the 1 officer that deployed the CEW would be submitting their own individual report. Because they've got a report on why they chose to use that specific use of force when it's used against an individual. Is that?
Yeah, that's very helpful. And then that individual, so if you have an officer who's in that scenario who also has drawn their firearm, their weapon, and that you have the taser also deployed, are they reporting individually as well? The officer who?
The officer that has a firearm, no. That would be captured in the data as the team. If we had the first scenario that I painted, it would capture all the different use of force options. So in a scenario and within our data, it's not just one use of force option. That there could be multiple use of force options that are utilized by all the different officers.
And just to follow up to that question, and then how many incidents that you have where there's a perceived weapon and then actual weapon? Because I didn't see that with regard to the data.
I don't know where they perceived an actual data, like how many calls, like where an information will come out that perceived individuals are perceived to have access to a weapon, but then it becomes unfounded, or?
That data is not, there isn't a data point on the use of force form with respect to whether or not there was an actual, whether the weapon was a real or versus replica or not.
It's just based on officer's perception. Why? So if we went back into the public training aid, it's what perception the officer was believing and then their response to that individual. Whether it is actually proven isn't anywhere that's captured on the report.
Well, on the form, in the beginning, you had on one of the forms that there was a firearm was used. I thought that was on the intake form. That's not reported by the officer after the incident, whether or not a weapon was used or found to be used.
No, it's not.
Sorry.
Just finish that. We're just going to end the questions there and try and get the RIBD strategy update in, and then we'll take all the questions at the end of the presentation. Okay? So thank you, Inspector Darren Murphy. I'm now going to call on Staff Sergeant Ryan Hashimoto and our RIBD analyst, Daniel Winsano, to do the RIBD update.
All right. Excuse me. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here tonight. My name is Ryan Hashimoto. I'm the Staff Sergeant of our Hate Crime, Community Relations, and EDI unit. Tonight, myself, Daniel Molsmith here, Chloe Montre, and 2 members of our Community Advisory Panel are going to be providing you with an update to our RIBD strategy. So the agenda for this portion of the presentation, we're going to do a brief overview of the RIBD strategy. We're going to get into a little bit of the analytical foundations. There's going to be a presentation by our Community Advisory Panel, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the work ahead. So the race and identity-based strategy is a core part of our service's commitment to delivering policing that is equitable, accountable, and aligned with human rights principles. This strategy was developed in response to a long-standing and well-documented reality that Black, Indigenous, and other racialized groups have been overrepresented in police interactions and across the broader justice system. These patterns are not new, and neither are the calls for action. The purpose of the RIBD strategy is to respond to those calls through a structured, transparent, and community-informed approach. It's about moving from acknowledgement to action. It centers equity, not equality, recognizing that different communities have different lived realities and therefore need different supports. The action that starts with data, because without it, we can't measure disparities, monitor progress, or identify where policies or practices may need to change. But data alone is not enough. The RIBD strategy is also about shifting culture. It challenges us to look critically at how decisions are made, how officers are trained and supported, and how organizational norms impact equity. It's grounded in a set of guiding principles: equity and inclusion, transparency and accountability, data privacy, and community engagement. We're not just collecting information, we're building a process that respects the rights and lived experiences of communities while supporting our members succeed in dynamic environments. We started with the use of force as the first area of analysis, but this is just the beginning. Future areas will be prioritized through continued community input. So in short, the RIBD strategy is a roadmap for structural and cultural change. It helps us identify where inequities exist, understand why they occur, and build systems that result in fair and just outcomes. So before we talk a little bit about where we're headed, I think it's important that we briefly reflect on how we got here. We officially launched the strategy a few months ago, actually in February of this year, in the room across the hall that we were supposed to be in. If you weren't at that session, you're looking for more details regarding the strategy itself, you can head to our website. The address is on the bottom here, hamiltonpolice.on.ca/RIBD. With that said, while the launch happened this year, the groundwork for this initiative actually started about 8 years ago in June of 2017, when Ontario introduced the Anti-Racism Act. That was followed in April of 2018 with the province's anti-racism data standards. The goal was to give the public sector organizations better tools to identify and address systemic racism in policies, programs, and services, and to help build a society where everyone is provided equal opportunity. Since 2019, police services have been required to collect and analyze race-based data specifically related to use of force. The data is pulled provincially from the provincially mandated use of force reports, which Inspector Murphy just went through. Then in 2020, HPS began including race-based data in our use of force reports, presentations to the Police Services Board. But by 2023, it became increasingly clear that that reporting data wasn't enough. We needed to do more with what it was that we were learning. That same year, the Ontario Association of the Chiefs of Police committed to moving this framework forward by providing a framework to support services in building out their own RIBD strategies. So we received that framework in late 2023, and that marked the beginning of our strategy work in a more formal way. We brought together an internal committee and hosted our first ever community information session in February of 2024. Many of you were there. In June of last year, we took a major step forward with the formation of our RIBD Community Advisory Panel, or as we call it, the CAP. You'll hear more from the CAP later in this presentation. Over the past year, they put a lot of effort to help lay the foundation for the strategy. And we know if we want to make lasting, meaningful progress, that foundation has to be solid. Since launching the RIBD strategy, we've made significant progress, especially through our partnership with the CAP. Just in this year alone, we've met 9 times with sessions ranging from 90 minutes up to 3 hours long. These meetings have been detailed, focused, and collaborative. Together, we've refined the overall approach and rollout of the RIBD strategy. We've dug deep into how we measure racial inequities in use of force, critically reflecting on disproportionality, disparities, and benchmark selections. Developed, refined, and prioritized a list of core community questions that will guide future analysis, and started to lay the groundwork for how we will engage the public as we release new findings and recommendations. The CAP will speak to these in more detail shortly, but we want to acknowledge the tremendous depth and scope of what's already been accomplished here. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Daniel Moseneff, our RIBD analyst, to discuss some analytical foundations.
Thank you very much. Another person coming to the podium, so I apologize for all the differences in individuals. So I started as an RIBD analyst back in January, and I believe it was the second meeting with the CAP that we really got into discussing some of the numbers, some of the statistics with respect to use of force, specifically disproportionality indices and disparity indices and benchmarks. And so it was really from that get-go and from that initial meeting where really I got their perspectives on this. And so to give everyone here a little bit of some background in terms of some of the legal requirements and analytical foundations, because really they are important at this point. So in Ontario, as was mentioned, the collection and analysis of race-based data, it isn't optional. It's a legal requirement under the Anti-Racism Act of 2017. So these rules require public sector organizations, such as a police service, Hamilton Police Service, to calculate disproportionality and disparity indices as a starting point. Helping to flag where different racial groups or racialized individuals may be experiencing unequal outcomes. So this isn't just merely a compliance exercise. This is part of our broader journey towards more transparent, accountable, and community-informed policing. But these tools, important as they are, they scratch the surface in terms of what we can understand with respect to racial disparities in use of force. They raise key questions, but they don't explain causes or contexts. That's why we're committed to going even deeper than the minimally required standards under the Ontario Anti-Racism Data Standards. Beyond service level metrics, to examine how multiple intersecting factors ultimately shape outcomes in use of force. So with the help of our advisory panel, we're taking steps to better interrogate and to understand our data. Not just to identify disproportionalities, but to understand, again, what is driving them and what we can do about it. So what are these words? What are disproportionality and what are disparity indices, and what can they ultimately tell us about our data? So the word disproportionality, it simply means something is out of proportion, okay? So a disproportionality index in this context tells us whether a racial group appears more or less often in an outcome than we would expect, okay? In policing, and what we're talking about today, is this often means comparing how often a group shows up in use of force data compared to how large that group might be in the general population, like a general population benchmark, or among those who have had police contact, for instance. So it's, again, one of the minimally required tools highlighted under Ontario's anti-racism data standards to help identify areas of concern. So that's saying a lot, but what does this mean? So the formula for disproportionality is very simple. So you take the percentage of the group in the outcome, like use of force, and you divide it by the percentage in a benchmark population. So I'll talk a little bit about benchmark populations because this is a very key thing that we discussed with CAP. So if a group makes up 8% of Hamilton's population, but appears in 20% of use of force cases, the index is 2.5. So what does that 2.5 mean? That means that they show up in use of force cases, whatever that group might be, 2.5 times more likely than we would expect based on how many individuals are in the population based on that group, okay? So this doesn't tell us why it's happening, but it does flag a possible problem, or a problem that needs investigation, sorry. So disparity is one step forward from there. After we calculate disproportionality indices for different groups, we can then compare those groups to one another. Okay? So a disparity index, this tells us how much more or less likely a group is to experience an outcome like police use of force compared to a reference group. So in most analyses and most of the academic literature, the reference group is those individuals perceived to be white. So a disparity index of 1, that means there's no difference, and a value often a threshold of 1.5, that suggests a meaningful disparity that may require further review. So it's important to understand that disparities, they can show up at any point during initial police contact, during decision to use force, or in later outcomes. But overall, the idea of disparity is to flag whether outcomes differ significantly across groups. Once again, with some more math. I really like stats. So, walking through an example, suppose a racial group has a disproportionality index of 3, okay? So that means they appear in use of force cases 3 times more as likely than we would expect, okay, based on population or based on police contact. So if we were to divide this by our reference category, often those perceived to be white, we divide 3 by 0.85, we get a disparity index of 3.53. So that means that this group is 3.5 times more likely to experience force relative to the reference group based on what we would expect that group to be in the population or enforcement actions, okay? So once again, it's a clear signal that disparity may be significant and worth investigating further. I keep referencing with respect to general population versus enforcement category, enforcement context. So if we want to take this approach seriously in in order to measure whether there is over or underrepresentation, we need a comparison point if we're going to use this tool, okay? What we call a benchmark. So a benchmark is needed because it helps us to explain the question, okay, compared to what? Are these numbers low or high, expected or not? Without a benchmark, disproportionality and disparity doesn't work. So the first benchmark that is we often see in the use of force outcomes, whether it's in Toronto or other services, is to use racial data from StatsCan to compare who lives in Hamilton to who was involved in use of force incidents. Okay, so it's straightforward, it's very easy to understand, but this ultimately has limitations. It reflects broader social inequalities that shape who come into contact with police in the first place. These factors are not ultimately not within the purview or control of police services, but part of a larger shared responsibility. Another challenge with a general population benchmark is that it might include individuals who will never interact with police, which makes it harder to separate the role of police actions from the effects of broader social conditions. So regardless, this is why this benchmark is useful for identifying big picture racial disparities and disproportionalities, not always pinpointing what is happening with specific encounters. Then we can consider enforcement benchmarks. Okay, so enforcement context being comparing racial groups involved in use of force to those already arrested or apprehended. So this allows for a more focused look at how people are treated once they've had contact with officers. It helps us ask the question, are individuals being treated equitably during enforcement actions? But this also has limitations, okay? It doesn't tell us who was stopped in the first place or why. Those decisions, like where officers might be deployed, who gets questioned, who is charged, and which ultimately can be shaped by a lot of different things. So while this benchmark gives us insight into treatment after contact, it can't show whether contact itself was fair. That's why we use, and on the recommendation of our CAP, is to, as a starting point, at least using both of these benchmarks, but realizing that there are differences in them. So each benchmark gives us a different perspective. Neither is complete on its own. This is, again, going back to legislation, doing so is consistent with the guidance from Ontario's Ministry of the Solicitor General and that Standard 30 and the Anti-Racism Data Standards Act, which requires public agencies to choose benchmarks that fit outcomes and explain why they're selected. So in other words, there is no concrete guidelines in what benchmarks public sector organizations use. We use both. And lastly, to discuss disproportionality and disparity, they're required and they're critical starting points. These tools show who appears more or less often in use of force cases, but they don't tell us why force may have been used, whether different levels of force were applied in similar situations, or what factors ultimately were at play, the multitude of factors, obviously. Our community advisory panel has raised deep questions around this, about context, about decision-making. And so to answer these questions raised by the CAP, which they will be doing, we need to analyze multiple interacting factors that may be driving disproportionalities and disparities. So in terms of our statistics of our disproportionalities and disparities for 2024, so I hope that everyone can see this okay. So for 2024, what do we see? What you're looking at here is a visual comparison of the disproportionality indices. This tells us whether a racial group is over or underrepresented in use of force incidents based on two benchmarks, and I know it's quite small here. The census benchmark, which is those individuals in the Hamilton community, and the enforcement benchmark being those who are arrested or apprehended by police. The light blue bar is the general population, and the dark blue bar, oh, whoops, my bad, uh-oh. I'm nervous as it is, right? So the key takeaway here. So those individuals perceived to be Black show a high disproportionality of 3.2 using the population benchmark, okay? But we see that when we transition to an enforcement benchmark, this is 1.2. So we see that when it comes to who is coming into police contact versus a general population benchmark, there are differences here. ultimately these two measures themselves have their limitations. Those perceived to be Middle Eastern remain consistently overrepresented in both benchmarks. So no matter if we're considering our Hamilton population or enforcement benchmarks, we are seeing this disproportionality across both groups. You'll notice a high disparity index for those perceived to be East and Southeast Asian. First of all, there's a relatively low count of individuals that are involved in use of force that are perceived to be from this racial category. Upon further look, about half of these cases are linked to warrant executions, oftentimes tied to special projects, which ultimately, which these benchmarks like this, they can't necessarily capture. So these shifts in disproportionality levels across benchmarks, it's important. When enforcement benchmarks are used, we see one thing, and when we use population benchmarks, we see another thing. So in any event, this underscores the need for a deeper analysis of how individual, situational, contextual factors interact, and something that will be looked at in the next stage of our RIVD report. This was relative differences, so I was talking about disparities before. So we take the disproportionality index for those perceived to be from a racialized category divided by those who are perceived to be white, and a few different things we see here. Again, when we use the general population, individuals perceived to be Black have a disparity index of 3.6. This drops to 1.3 when we consider the enforcement benchmark, which just shows the variation and moving between benchmarks. The patterns are ultimately the same when we compare, like I was discussing before, of those who are Southeast Asian, as well as are those perceived to be Middle Eastern. So these indices give us critical starting points. They show which groups are over or underrepresented in use of force incidents and how those patterns might shift depending on the benchmark that we use. But these measures altogether, they don't explain the why. They don't tell us whether force was appropriate, the circumstances, how organizational, individual, or systemic factors play a role. So we often talk about the drivers of disparity. Many times in these community info sessions, this has been showed. So this gets into the context of why we may see disparities. Obviously, there are things on the internal side, whether it's the individual officer characteristics, biases, internal with respect to organization. And then we can also see on the bottom quadrant, whether it be individuals' choices and actions or anything happening external at that sort of contextual level, whether that be economic factors, social environment, et cetera. This is ultimately what we are working with our CAP. Much of the CAP questions, which we'll be talking about in a little bit, are trying to get at. So in line with, again, standard 32 of the anti-racism data standards, it calls on public institutions to sort of go beyond basic statistics and to consider more sophisticated multiple factor analyses, which we're ultimately hoping to get at. And I can pass it over to you, Ryan.
Okay. Awesome, thanks, Daniel. So the work ahead is being directly informed by our community advisory panel. It's their questions that are helping us to decide what to analyze, how to interpret it, and where to look deeper. So currently, our current iteration of the CAP is composed of 10 diverse members with expertise in social services, academia, advocacy, community organizing, and their contributions are grounded both in lived experience as well as subject matter expertise. So engagement with the CAP ensures that the RIVD strategy is more than just a technical process. It's a meaningful way to incorporate community priorities, identify structural challenges, and develop actionable insights. So this is our current version of the CAP. These are the members of it. And I'm going to turn things over now to Juanita Perron and Natalie Stravins from our community advisory panel to come up and share.
Hi, everyone. Forgive me if we had to do some shuffling with who would be here. So I kind of doing this a little bit off the cuff, but I promise that I've been very involved. I'm actually one of the co-chairs for the CAP. Both Juanita and I have been part of the CAP when we started in last June. And as Staff Sergeant Hashimoto had said, that while we've had 9 meetings this year, we were meeting last year as well. And a lot of what we were doing last year was building the framework of what the CAP would be like and how we would work. So most of this year is now we've got that strong framework built, and now we're getting into the data, as Daniel brought up. And we're now starting to work with the use of force data, but as mentioned, our strategy isn't just about the use of force data. This is what we're starting with. This is almost like our case study of how we can look at race and identity-based analysis of interactions with the police. And hopefully we can expand this to other factors of what policing looks like, and also be an example to other, hopefully, community and municipal departments across the city, whether that be hospital, the healthcare system, the children's aid system, and any other aspects where we see these disparities based on race and identity. So, yeah, first I want to establish the role. We are an advisory committee for the Hamilton Police Service, which means we have no institutional power, no decision-making power. That's not to say that they haven't been taking our recommendations, but at the end of the day, we can let them know what our thoughts are, and we do have that conversation of why these thoughts are there, but you know, at the end of the day, it is up to the police and the police board to make those final decisions of how we'll move forward. That being said, we have had great discussions about collaboration, discussions about moving forward in terms of when there is disagreement, and how we will track that. Sometimes the disagreement is not necessarily due to different beliefs, but it's just the way the institutional factors work. Some things we would be asking for just can't be done. Some data where we want to be captured, there's just no way for that data to be captured. But we still are recording that so that there is something that in the future, if the community would have questions about what's the CAP do in this situation, we have a record to say, you know, we brought this up and we definitely recognize that. And this is why it wasn't adopted, whether it was something police just disagree with, whether it was something they would love to do in the future, but there's just no infrastructure for that right now, etc. Yeah, so that is basically what the CAP is. As they mentioned, we come from different lived experiences. I think 90% of the CAP is a member of a racialized group. The only person who is not is a professor at McMaster who has a background in statistics, and but he's actually the one who I would say pushes back on the police more than and I think that speaks to good ways that people can be good allies, knowing that the privilege that they hold and mobilizing those that in positive ways. So yeah, so right now, like I said, our scope right now is based on the use of force data and ways we can, as Tina brought up, the why. The police are only required to tell you, you know, this people group are disproportionately, have force disproportionately used against them, and it was this much have guns, these ones have that, but at the end of the day, we don't know why, we don't know how, and there's no what now that comes out of that. You know, we are seeing like trends change, and we can talk about how there's more gun violence, there is more incidents revolving around that, but at the end of the day, we're looking to improve the relationship between the police and the community, and also reduce that disparity that we historically know. You know, as part of the last several months, as I said, as we've been establishing, one of the big things that we have done is, and as been mentioned before, we did go through the use of force training that the police have to do annually. And it was a really good experience to not just learn, to learn what police are actually taught. Because when we look at the statistics, it's kind of hard to tell where does officer bias start and institutional bias begin. And when you go through the training, you see this is what the officers are taught. And it's not perfect, you know, you don't know what's going on in an actual squad and what a sergeant is telling the people, but it's a good start for us to know where are these institutional biases and where are the officer biases. And when we can start to decipher that, we can ask better questions about how can we better analyze this data, how can we better provide recommendations for changes to training. Like even in that training, we came back with a huge list of recommendations, such as, you know, when we're talking about de-escalation techniques, there's no cultural bias training really in that. And when we're talking about communication, and you have people in Hamilton coming from all sorts of cultures, if we don't have that cultural bias, cultural training inside that, what may seem to be a de-escalation communication technique may be rude to another culture, and they're actually escalating the situation. But because there's that gap, that was one thing we had mentioned of like, maybe this is something we can look at, how can we add this into this annual training? And it's great that it happens annually. So as the city is constantly changing, that's something that can be further updated. So those are the type of like recommendations we are able to give. That's not been instituted right now, and that, like I said, that was just one of the recommendations, but that's what we mean where we're giving that feedback on, and how the police implement it is up to them, but we are making a record. Related to that is CAP really wanted to gain a little bit more of autonomy as we worked through this past year, as we're growing and we're developing. And in that is, we were always meeting with the police every time we met last year. And we realized that, not that they don't give us a space to talk, like there were times where we asked, hey, can we have 5 minutes with no police or whatever, to just have a discussion. But and not to say that we were afraid to talk in front of them, but sometimes you do need those spaces to have those conversations, to know what we can bring up or stuff we can bring up as a board, so that there's a bit of unity when we're talking to the police about it. And if someone's not comfortable bringing that up by themselves, you know, being the chair, often what my role is in these meetings in the beginning is to kind of talk about what the CAP has been discussing. And, you know, coming from me is never coming from me. I'm like kind of just speaking as an advocate for the board. So out of that, with that need for autonomy, is we started meeting monthly-ish, in addition to our bi-weekly meetings with the police this year. And we meet for about an hour monthly, and there we are able to talk on our own without the supervision of the police, and have some of those more have a safe space to have that sensitive discussion, so that by the time we're bringing it up to police, it's more sophisticated and can be applied to the stuff we have there. So yeah, some of the questions that we have been looking at asking, and I know that this has been brought up, is about the idea of perceived race. And I know this is a very contentious aspect of use of force data, because, and it was understandable. We had CAP members who had questions about why are we using perceived race. Ultimately, at least from my point of view, what this use of force data is checking is how are the police disproportionately reacting to members, people of color within the community. And maybe it's a bit callous to say, but you know, if you have an officer who has a bias and thinks you're Black, for example, it doesn't, not that it doesn't matter that that's not your race, but any bias in the way they treated you is because of the perception that they think that you're of that race. And you know, there might be other externalities that are also impacting how they feel, but when we're talking about specific race, it's not like policemen would ask, like, it's not like you would say if a policeman's already treating you in a way that may be deemed unlawful later on, and you were to say, oh, but I was actually this race. That doesn't really change the situation if they thought at the time that you were this other. So, that being said, we do miss stuff when you perceive race. Right now, there's no way to really account for actual race in the way data is collected, because not all these incidents does the person disclose their race? Is there a way? There's no like form to record it, and we've been having conversations about how to remedy that. As was said earlier, the form is ministry mandated, so the form is kind of fixed. However, we have talked about possibility in the future having an addendum form that is Hamilton specific, and that could, as we're thinking about more questions we want to ask with that specific form, we could think about more data points that could be added there. But that is an additional administrative burden on our officers, so this is something that's still in negotiation. But that is one of the things that makes it also hard for us to get to use something other than perceived race. And one thing we noticed is because of the perceived race, a lot of people who are Indigenous are very undercounted in the data, because a lot of people who are Indigenous are perceived to be other races, and also may have different issues regarding to socioeconomic status, which is a bit harder to capture in that data. And that's a big reason why, while we believe in the idea of like the perceived race, and we understand the need for it, and there's no reason, kind of like with the benchmark question of no reason to get away from it completely, but it might be a thing in the future we might have to have more robust data. And the second question is kind of how we came up with the multiple benchmarks. As shown, it captures different data. You know, sorry, no, this is not that one. This is about situational factors. This is another thing that we're trying to figure out how to capture the data. How do we see, when we're talking about de-escalation techniques, an incident might be the same on paper, but the officers use different things to de-escalate. And when we go to the use of force training, you know, the trainers really emphasize, like, while on paper this might be the same incident, there are other like externalities that make it harder. This officer knows this person. They know that this person kind of gets really agitated really quickly, which is why they were a little they used a little bit more force on this person than other, because they have that past experience, or something in the call that one of the witnesses called. And there are all these other externalities that impact the situational factors. However, we still really wanted to capture what steps are where's that officer bias thing. And while we recognize that every incident is unique, you can make every incident unique until you have N1 of everything. So we've been trying to think about ways of controlling for the situational factors, recognizing that may not be perfect, but we have to start somewhere. We have to be able to track, why did an officer use the XYZ de-escalation techniques with these individuals, but not with these individuals, and what causes those disparities? And I'm sure, based on your own life experience or things reading in paper, you know that sometimes I think as a person of color, sometimes you leave an instant wondering, like, were they a little harsher speaking to me than they would if it was someone else? And then obviously, if I was having a mental health crisis and they were talking in a more agitated tone, how did that reflect towards me? You know, they started approaching me, but some other people might have given me space. What is driving the differences in approaches? Sometimes it's just the way that specific officer acts. Sometimes it is driven by race, and we're trying to kind of figure out where does the officers and the training start, and where do, you know, when we have that 4-quadrant, we're trying to figure out the stuff that we can control. Where does that happen, and where are the other situational factors?
And just to emphasize on that, you have to understand that when an officer is trying to do de-escalation in a situation, there is no good time to say, how do you racially identify yourself? okay? There just isn't a moment when that's a good time to ask that question. And a lot of people, like in Indigenous cultures, we have a saying of what we call white passing. So not all First Nations, Inuit, Métis people are going to look distinctively Native, but the officer's perception in that moment of time when they have to handle the situation and respond to a crisis, they don't have a moment when they can say, oh, by the way, can you please help me fill out which checkbox I should put you into? That's not going to work. That's not feasible for the subject or the officer, okay? So we're trying to help understand the officers. They have this one moment in time to fill out a form where it's their perception in that moment of time. And we have multiculturalism in Canada, so they're not going to get it right. But it's going to also help the public understand these reports are highly underreported because that officer has to make a judgment in that moment in time to fill out a form that's required by the ministry. So it's not going to be accurate reporting. We're not going to get 100% of the numbers. We're not going to get it all. The police are not going to get it accurate, but understand that they have to make a decision in that moment in time. And when, a person's being arrested and apprehended and being brought to wherever they need to go to next, there's no good time to ask that question of a person to see if the officer was correct or not. The only thing that the legislation requires is what is the officer's perception in that moment of time based on their lived experience. And nobody gets it right, and depending upon the environment the officers have had in their life experience, they may not know. They may not be able to distinguish between a Middle Eastern person and a Latino person. That's the reality. So in fairness to them, we're trying to tether out, as CAP, we're trying to tether out the pieces of how can we get that actual better numbers, but also that truly reflects the real population of what's happening with the interaction with police. Not in a negative light, but we know that the numbers are substantially higher. But just to make you aware that the CAP committee is aware that the numbers are substantially higher than what's being reflected. Because that officer makes a decision, I think it's this one. They may get it right, they may get it wrong. We don't know, but they have that moment to get it, and there's no way to go back and ask the individual, say, how do you personally self-identify? There's just not a good moment during that process to ask that.
One final thing I will say about the benchmark question is there was one of the reasons we also went and included is to have our data and our reports be as robust as possible. We didn't want an accusation of like, as a Black woman, I see the Black, when you look at comparing to police incidences, you see it going down, and it could be very easy to be like, okay, I'm worried that now they're not going to take anti-Black racism seriously in the city now because they're going to say, well, yeah, it's because they have more incidents with the police. And we want to have that data captured because just because it goes down, then it doesn't mean that there isn't any disparity. It means we have more questions. It means why are they having more interactions with the police? And you get calls, the certain people calls. And then one of the things, like I said at the beginning, this is about the Hamilton Police, but as a CAP, we've been trying to think holistically as a city as we're building up the strategy. And when we think about something like calls is, okay, are schools more likely to call the police into that incident when it's a Black student versus another student? And though that is some of the data that we're going to be looking into the future of, okay, yes, when you account for police incidents, this goes down, but why are they having more police incidents? And having that not as a full stop, but now let's go deeper. And I think being very honest with the data in that way and not just doing, I don't want to say the easy, but just be like, just the flat data of interactions. Another thing we're also looking at is geographical area. Yeah, they might be represented more, but where are the police situated more? Are they situated in downtown Hamilton more? Who's living in downtown Hamilton versus Ancaster? And how is that reflected in the data? So we've also been looking at geographical issues and how that affects. It's not a perfect measure of socioeconomic worth, but it adds that additional factor as we're analyzing stuff. So like we said, we're still in the early stages, and we would love more community input. While we have a CAP that is relatively diverse, both in their personal identity, their occupation, their lived experience, the immigration status. At the end of the day, we're individuals, and I can't say that I speak for every African child of immigrant in Hamilton woman. I still have one perspective, and we, as I mentioned, we're looking in the future of having more community, like very CAP-specific community spaces where we can meet with different communities, kind of tell them what we found out so far, and have those very interactive discussions so that we can bring a more a well-rounded perspective back to the police as we're developing the strategy.
Question? Do we have an opportunity for questions?
I'll come back after the question.
Natalie and Juanita, thank you so much for sharing from the CAP's perspective. Finally, I want to call out our manager of analytics, Chloe Nitrate.
So I've been given the honors to close today. My name is Chloe Nitrate. For those of you that don't know me, I also like statistics. Many of you are familiar faces, both constructive critics and those that we've worked alongside throughout the years as we embarked on our race and identity-based data strategy. Community has always been at the heart of this work. You've held us accountable, guided us with your lived experience, and offered us grace in our missteps, bringing forward insight, wisdom, and perspective. Now, as we move on to this execution phase of the strategy, I am reminded of the power of community and collaboration, especially with our ongoing partnership with our community advisory panel. Together, we aim to advance a shared vision of equitable policing in the city of Hamilton, beginning with our deepening our collective understanding of use of force and the systems that shape it. As we continue to move forward, we need to recognize that we need to go beyond these surface level metrics like disproportionality and disparity indices. These numbers are really only starting points. Real change comes from understanding the why behind these disparities and then acting on that understanding. The next leg of this journey requires us to dig deeper, to analyze the data with nuance, rigor, and most importantly, responsibility. This process will not be done in isolation. It will be grounded in our relationship with the community and guided by the voices at the table. We've already started envisioning what grassroots conversations look like as we will be returning the findings to the community for collective action planning. While we don't know exactly what the data will reveal or what the solutions will be, we know that answers will come through collaboration. Individually, we each hold a piece of the puzzle, but together we see the whole picture. On a personal note, I have some news to share. In the coming weeks, I'll be wrapping up my time with HPS. As I reflect, I can say with certainty that this work with all of you has been the most meaningful chapter of my career. I'm proud of the leadership of Chief Bergen, and what he's demonstrated is the investment that HPS has made into this work. But what prides me the most is my confidence that even as people change positions, the sustainability of this work will endure. Because sustainable work isn't just about completing tasks as check marks. It's about building systems, habits, relationships that will allow progress to continue long after we've stepped away. The next chapter of this work will help answer long-standing questions from our community. We remain committed to meeting our legislative obligations under the Anti-Racism Act and continuing advocacy at the provincial level, encouraging other services to begin or deepen their own journeys. Thank you for being here today. Legacy begins with intention, and your presence, your participation is part of building that legacy. Every time you show up, you contribute to a foundation of change for the generations to come, and I cannot wait to follow along from the sideline. Thank you, and I sincerely apologize for running a little bit over time. We will be having a feedback survey for you, and I will leave that up there. And at this moment in time, I'd like to invite members of the panel to come up and answer questions, and I appreciate your patience with holding the questions. So we'll invite any questions, moderators. Feel free to take our first question.
Okay, yeah.
Hi, my name's Emil Joseph. I'm an associate professor in school of social work, academic director of the Office of Community Engagement, and I hold a professorship in equity, identity, and transformation. I've spoken with the family and friends of Erickson Cabrera, and I share all that because there were some presumptions made about why some people were here. I would just want to say at the outset that we got this report yesterday. And there was some acknowledgement of the impacts of something like this and the year-over-year impacts of hearing in a report about violence done to racialized communities. And the idea that, you know, there was some other place to go, we needed to have a moment. Yet, we were told this meeting goes from 6 to 7:30, and we're not allowed to speak until 15 minutes after the fact. I think if anybody wants to know what systemic racism is as an expert, that's it. There's a lot of problems with the report itself. And I think, you know, when we hear the word de-escalation repeated back to us, and it shows up in the report 29 times, and it's including police training, but in the case with Erickson, and this is a quote, he was immediately met with gunfire from the officers. That failure to apply de-escalation resulting in death is not in this report. When speaking about discharging weapons in the report, Erickson's killing is mentioned alongside euthanizing animals. And I don't know who's advising, but this is a deeply disrespectful way to represent that. I think the omission of the disparity index does a number of things. I would say, as a scholar on race and violence, that looking into the research on systemic racism in benchmarks and practices themselves might be a useful endeavor. I feel like there is a race and identity-based group, and we're still receiving a report authored by HPS. And it definitely includes biased analyses and their own conclusions drawn. For example, emphasizing total interactions to dilute, et cetera. And there's a conclusion drawn that increased use of force is due to more weapons, yet, you know, nothing about omitting the disparity index, the death data, failure to apply de-escalation training resulting in death, or that, more broadly, anti-EDI discourses have exacerbated in the last years, as well as overt systemic racism broadly. There's also no conflict of interest section. You know, even in the presentation, weapons calls increased 5% year over year, and use of force is up 14%, and that was mentioned as in line, which those are in line, right? I appreciate the conversation around deeper analysis and more work, and the work that the panel is doing to meet around some of these things. But some of these things have been said here before in these meetings, year over year. And I raise all that context out of frustration, and I'm sorry to do it. And I just want to communicate that none of that feels like trust or respect. And I don't think that's how we get anywhere better. I think I want to ask, if possible, that we could get such a report maybe 2 weeks in advance prior to a meeting where we can communicate about it and allocate enough time so that people could ask questions, especially in the wake of something like so impactful, so profound, that talks about violence to our community members.
I think first of all, we can definitely own up that we had to change rooms and some of the delays happened. We're happy to stay back and discuss these questions. And with the report, I can definitely say that we provided that last night, and we should have provided it earlier. That's something that we can own up and push forward. Is there any specific questions you want to ask about de-escalation or some of the reporting or benchmarks? That's something you can definitely ask that way. But I appreciate your comments, and we're all hearing you.
Can I make a quick comment with respect to
I don't want to take
disparity?
up any more.
No, sorry. If the disparity indices and the disproportionality indices for 2024, there's 2 reports. I'm not sure which ones were received or were sent out. And the specific RAED use of force report includes the disproportionality indices from this year.
I was talking about the use of force report.
Right, so so you're talking about the use of force report. Those indices are not included in that use of force report. They're included in, there's 2 reports this year. Again, I'm not sure if you received both. It's in the RAB. They will be presented at board. And those statistics which I presented are included in that report. So a matter of getting us to,
Thank you.
discuss.
The other thing I want to share around timelines and releasing of reports, we did have special permission from the chief to release a report in advance of going to the board. Typically speaking, we are to wait until the date at which it can be publicly available. Upon the chief's permission, he granted us permission to send it out. Apologies that it was yesterday. We had some technical issues for that, but everything that you said we've taken under advisement, and we can look at how we can integrate that with the guidance from our community advisory panel.
I just wanted to speak a little bit to your comment about these are things that, as a community, we've been bringing up for years and have not, even though the community advisory board is also bringing it up, like you've said in saying these things. And that kind of goes back to when I was saying about how we wanted some of that more independence and kind of not just be feeling, we want to work in collaboration with the Hamilton Police Board, but not feel shepherded. And that's where it also came into, we wanted to be more intentional about recording all our recommendations so that there is something, not just for us, for you guys to hold us accountable, but for us to hold the police accountable. So we can go back to them and be like, we have told you this, and all these recommendations have been hypothetically just not taken into, and we have that log. And when I ask, when we're asking you to come into these future things and send that to me, I can give you my email afterwards so that I can also include that. That's another reason we want to bring the community involved, and we don't want to just be the 10 of us. We want to have, we did not want to, one thing the CAP was really, really passionate about in our first independent meeting was not wanting to feel like a rubber stamp for the police. To just say, you know, we've got our group of racialized people who said, oh, this is great. And staff, like, we want, if the police have said they want to come to the community and be collaborative, we want to hold them accountable in that way. Not to say, you know, like I said, they have been receptive to us telling them we were doing that. There's nothing to stop, but we do want to be very intentional about anything that we say and anything we log, any disagreements, having that, and having, hopefully never come, but having that, like, that articulated as often and as frequently as we can.
And be mindful that the CAP is one of the first ones in Ontario that we're at the second phase, so I think it's important for us to be mindful of that.
Okay, so first of all, good that you're acknowledging this and starting some process, so that's good.
Yeah.
CAB is also, looks like in good hands. My only suggestion is, you have a lot of perception-based indices. Start putting some actuals, like 310 perceived or called in. What is the actual?
Right, and just in response to that, it's challenging for us to actually capture the actual race of the individual, but there is stuff that's happening at Statistics Canada level to actually capture that data. So it is coming, and they have a full report on how they're going to reflect that. How we take that ability to capture that data and implement it into our service is something that we will be looking to do as part of this work.
But not for race, like we had calls for people having weapons.
Yeah.
I suspect someone carrying weapon, I call you in. I might be calling you in because I think that a Middle Eastern or a South Asian or a black person is more liable to that kind of thing. So once you come in, can you not make sure that, no, this person is not carrying a weapon? So out of 400 or 300 such calls, again, hypothetical number,
yeah,
only 100 yielded actual weapons. So that's a 25%. So that is tangible, that can be done.
Yeah.
And then that also can help you because, you put two over-index on sensors,
yes,
and then people in the system for whatever reason. So those gave you some information about this is over-indexed or over-represented, this is under-represented. If you add the actuals for heinous crime or weapons or something which you can go and verify, not the race, the actuals on those, it might help you further add a layer to the claims based on perceived race, perceived nationality, that can help. Just a suggestion.
On the line by lines that we provided, unfortunately last night, there are a narrative that talks about if the firearm was a replica, if it was found or not. So that information is there. I don't think we had the actual calculations, but in the narratives, that is indicated.
I don't have the reports, so I don't know.
It's included on some of them.
Yes.
It's not necessarily on all of them, it's just if it was in the report.
Okay, yes.
All right, first and foremost, thank you so much. This is my fourth, fifth time coming to see the report, so I want to thank all of you services for the hard work and also sharing this information. Which has been very helpful to get this report ahead of time so we can take a look at it. I just had a question in regards to team reporting. I understand from a data perspective, we need to collect, speaking on behalf of constituents, residents who live in Hamilton Downtown Mosque and around the area. We deal with a lot of community involvements with dealing with these services. In regards to team, hypothetically, just a hypothetical scenario, there was 5 officers who came to an incident, and 2 officers were senior officers, and 3 officers were youth of force. Who are the officers, that are in charge of submitting that report? That's one. And the follow-up of that is, some people may say that the junior officers or the younger officers might just go along with the senior officers reporting. So now, before individual officers would have to do their own report, and it would be one more precise. And sometimes information might be similar, but it could be different depending on scenarios. So now looking at it, I don't want to use the word effort, but it could
So
be perceived that way.
So that's why there is that 4-stage process. So it goes to the staff sergeant, and again, it's not just the report, okay, it's not important. They open up the occurrence. They will again look at all the information that's provided, if there's any inconsistencies. Just as well, too, even moving forward, will be interesting even moving forward next year is the body-worn cameras and reviewing footage, and will that help improve our accuracy, transparency? But that's why there's all those steps. Again, and that detailed report is a narrative of we've gone through all the reports and pulled out and verified the information and the data that's there. We are individuals reporting, there could be errors, but with that 4-stage process is really kind of the checks and balances. We try to make it as accurate as possible there. And then again, with the body-worn cameras, that will play, again, they're new. They're not involved in any of this data that we've got here, but how will that impact and transform how we do business in the future? So does that answer your question? Yeah, it's checks and balances.
Yeah, but I'm just looking at totally next year. That just have to show that for sure.
Thank you. Violetta?
There are a lot of questions about replica weapons or about weapons not being found. So I did read this the spreadsheet, and I did a count while we were all in this meeting. So out of the over 300 instances of use of force, 209 of them, there is something noted in the column called subjects weapons used. And weapons used, in my mind, when I hear that, means a weapon was present. So I read all 209, and of them, just over 50, 58, but if we're counting for some of them might be duplicates, about 50 of them, it's noted that a handgun or another weapon was in that column, but in the description it says that no weapon was found, or it was a replica like a toy, or in 6 cases a lighter was shaped like a gun. So only in 3 cases did that particular field of information, in my mind, get appropriately labeled as other, because a lighter shaped like a gun is not a gun, it's other. So which one is it for that particular column? Is it that about 50 of those fields were incorrectly labeled as should have been labeled other but was labeled as handgun, or was it those 3 that were mislabeled? Because I think that that particular column of information is really evocative in community. And so that about 25% of those cases, there was nothing found, or it was a toy or a replica, which I think also conveys, a specific piece of information to community, especially when we we see that kind of representation.
Thank you, Violeta.
Yeah, so it just an understanding too, it's the use of force report and then the line-by-line data are, like the line-by-line data is an expansion on that. We're reporting on the use of force information and the perception that an officer will have when he goes, she goes. The information that's provided could be that there's a handgun and it's not till after we find out that it is a lighter. Well, the officers can't wait to determine. Their perception is this person has access to the potential of having a firearm. Afterwards, it may be, proven that it's not an actual firearm and poses no threat, but they have to respond, or their perception has to be that it is real until proven otherwise.
So they're writing this report before they go in or after?
After, and if they're going based on why did you use the force that you chose to utilize, and it's based on the perception and the information that's been provided. Again, the information might have been provided from a dispatcher. The individual was seen, getting on a bus and a firearm dropped to their feet. Individual reporting it to 911 may not have the information or understanding that it's not real. We don't know that. We respond, we deal with the individual, and we determine it to be a lighter. And again, I think you said 8 or 6, it's quite common that we have those occurrences. But it's the officer's perception. Why did they use the force that they chose to use? Because they had perception, all right, that the person was armed, and that's provided. And that they have to react that way. And if an officer responded to a situation with a person that is armed with a weapon and didn't point a firearm, that would be for us to look at.
My last follow-up, I promise. In the other columns, it's called perceived race, but in that column, it's weapon use, not perceived weapon. And there isn't a categorization between a perceived gun versus an actual handgun. So what I worry is that it obfuscates and it kind of blurs the statistics that way. And in some cases, even if there are multiple suspects, it's noted as one handgun, and in one case, it's 11 handguns because there are 11 individuals. So I'm also a data nerd, so that's why I spend a lot of time.
And that's something for us to look at when we buy our line by lines, and just to see if there's methods to improve. Again, we're providing the use of force data that's off the use of force reports, and then the line by line breakdown. So again, if there's any discrepancies, we can certainly tighten that up for sure.
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks to the Hamilton Police panelists and everyone for it's my first time attending one of these, so I certainly learned a lot. So I had a question about the implementation of the body cams this year. So how will that impact the 2025 use of police report in terms of accountability for the police internally, but also for the public, right? With that footage, any footage, especially if there's an incident, a major incident, be available to the public, like it is like in the States, for example, like we see many videos. But what would that mean for the use of report for next year, 2025? And in terms of accountability, what does that mean in major incidents where the public, as well as the police, can sort of gauge and say, okay, there was an incident, this looks like this, So.
Great question.
So the 4 check process that we talked about where reports are issued, again, if the force report is submitted, supervisor, if there's body cam that's been flagged or, and should, in most cases be flagged, the supervisor should be reviewing, verifying. If it's not correct, the report isn't cleared with the supervisor and it's sent back, to be done properly. And then again, that will have an impact on it. As far as releasing body cam footage, I'm not sure what our policy is going to be.
We would have to look at, so for instance, if we have an incident where the SIU takes over that incident, we're not permitted to release that body footage. It would have to be released to the SIU. In other instances, it's always going to be a balance of respecting people's privacy, or right to privacy, versus the public wanting transparency.
Are there any questions online? No?
Just comments.
Are there any any yes, please, thank you.
Follow up to the body camera question. I know they were supposed to be fully rolled out by about, I think it was April of this year. Have they been rolled out to all officers in completion by this point in time?
Not the entire service, but anybody deployed in a frontline priority responders will have access to the body worn camera, sir. Yeah,
thank you.
They are rolled out. They are rolled out to the frontline service delivery member.
Lyndon, please.
This is a question for the audience here today. I know we had the chair of the board here, we had other members of the police service board here, but just so we can be on the record with regards to the polling of the room, how many people in this room believe that data when it comes to actual weapons being found should be part of the report? Hands up if you think that that's important data that should be included when it comes to use of force, if there is a weapon found or not. Hands up.
That's what I recommended. You have to have the answers.
No? Okay, I just wanted to get a quick poll in the room.
No.
Right.
So that have to be.
And did you have a question for?
The question here is, based on just the raising of the hands in the room here today, is there a commitment that the next report will have that information available to community? We would like to see whether or not that's a commitment that can be held, that this room is asking for in the room.
And the reason Lyndon is asking is because last year we asked for the same thing as well, right? So that's why Lyndon is asking this question, because last year at the previous use of force, we asked for that same data as well, and we don't have it. We go through the line by line, and we see that people call in, there's something, and then stuff happens, and that is it. Well, what if the person was roughed up? What if the person felt like, things happen and they don't have any recourse? And I also think is one thing that is and I said this last year as well, if we know that 90% of these calls are coming in, let's think about how we respond, because sometimes the public too might not have all the information. So that is some of the things that we've been saying in the last 3 years, is that you have somebody calling, you don't know what the information is, so let's think about it, because now we've had 3 years of all of these reports that are saying that more than 90% of these incidents are coming from calls. So let's think about that too, so that we don't show up at a place, somebody doesn't have a gun, they're arrested, something happens, or if worse, someone loses their life. So this data is important, and we don't want to come back next year again and ask the same question.
I think the point that Acting Inspector Murphy made, we have to respond to the information we're presented with at the time, right? So we don't know in some cases. Somebody calls in and says, there's a man with a gun in my neighborhood. I need the police. Can't change our response, thinking that there's a possibility that gun might not be real, unless we've got actual information to verify that, right? And sometimes that does come in. Sometimes we do hear, sounds like this is some kids. It sounds like this is not a real firearm. But we still have to respond, because our obligation is to make sure that the community is safe, right? A man with a gun who's in a neighborhood is obviously very panic-inducing for the community. So we need to respond accordingly. Afterwards, we might find out that that firearm is not real. It's based on the officer's perception and the information that they had available to them at the time, and they respond in accordance.
But I think they're just asking about adding that afterwards. They're not saying not to respond. Respond as you will.
Not something that is ultimately not going to change response of officers. You can't change that initial response, because the perception is going to be.
You have year over year though of like a giant number of times that there wasn't a gun when somebody said there was. You don't think that'll have an impact at the end of the day?
We don't have year over year.
No, because you're not telling us. See what I mean? Like if you actually every year, like this is how many calls people said they brought guns, that there was a gun, and there wasn't a gun, and we used force. And every year you had to report that, we'd have a better sense then of
Sure,
like,
I can
of like
understand
maybe
what
there's
you're
a
saying.
problem in terms of community interaction or understanding like people are saying there's guns when there aren't guns.
I just don't understand how an officer is going to make that determination and respond to a call.
But this
guy
data-
is
this
not.
data-
We're not saying the police officer should, we're saying in the report, we should get that data, not when the report is being done. So that now we can do the after analysis of the 90%, these were the numbers that came in with the call that said there was a weapon.
No, I
After
understand what
the
you're asking.
incident happened, these were the number of times where there was no gun. Now that can be used in the training that that is used for all officers. So those are the numbers that we're asking for.
So that would be an additional analysis piece that we have to do over and above what we're finding.
So I'm very clear that I welcome what you're asking me. Could you do me a favor to make sure that I clearly understand what you're asking? So I have my email, and I will make sure that I respond publicly on the board day about responding to that. What you're asking is actually realistic. It makes sense what you're asking. So just make sure I clearly understand what you're asking, what you want it to look like, and then I will make sure that our team has the capacity to do that. I think it's fair. I absolutely do. I respect that.
I just wanted to add to that. I think that is one thing that as a CAP we see as well, and we are very, which is when we're talking about the situational analysis, is that's one of the reasons we are trying to look at this, trying to figure out what these situational factors are, and that's an example of one of those, where we have this incident. It came out later that it was not, because what the data that this report is released is just the data that the report that we're releasing is like we're trying to look for the whys, and that's coming into the whys. And out of that is, at least as I'm discussing with him and as a CAP, what we're trying to figure out is, okay, the police have a standardized way of how they're supposed to address a situation when they think there's a weapon. But is there a disparity when someone calls and says someone has a weapon, and the individual that's claimed to have that weapon is one background versus the other background? And that's where we come in. So yes, on paper, they have the same situation, and we're going to see, we want to analyze, does that disparity exist? And if we do find that disparity exists, then we can go back to the police and say, I know that you guys say you have this training, but this disparity this disparity happens, so we need to go back to our training and see why our officers reacting differently when they're given the same information of an individual has a weapon, but this individual is someone who's perceived as white, and this individual is someone who's perceived as.
But do you think that will change, like an officer should have response the same way? They will not be changing their response, however data you have.
I don't know if that will change, but
No,
I don't know if that will change the situation. I'm going to be candid. However, I think when this is how I see my position in the CAP. This gives me something to go to the police and say, there is a clear disparity here. You guys are saying it's different because this community tends to interact with the cops more. It's different because it was, like you're saying, it's because they're getting more calls and this. And we can say, okay, but when we see the calls, when we capture this, when we go down this, there's still an officer bias. And I think at least my position is to really hold the police accountable and kind of whittle down all these externalities to figure out that is. So that's what we're working on. I don't know, I can't commit to if that line by line will be there, because like I said, the CAP doesn't have any institutional power, but I will commit that those type of granular situational factors are things that the CAP is very passionate about making sure shows up in future reports. And as a chair of the CAP, that's one thing that I personally commit to, that as to the best of my ability, those specific instances, and that's what we've been pushing for, to the best of how that data can be collected. Because we're looking at the post-mortem to see what can we do to make things better.
Thank you, Natalie. And for the sake of time, we'll have Emil Joseph. Go ahead.
No, sorry, Dr. Emil, the one.
Oh, George?
Yes, I apologize. Yeah, I've been standing up for a long time.
I was just saying, in the use of force report,
talk about the disparity analysis, where I think this gentleman said that that disparity analysis is in a different report. But if I think that it would be prudent to have that analysis in the use of force, because the use of force is one document in itself. The RBID report is a separate thing.
Do you want to address that then? Or?
I understand it is a separate thing. The idea is that everything with respect to race and identity, again, it's related. We're talking about use of force. It's the same context. There's a deeper discussion on these disparities and a chance to actually discuss them at a deeper level relative to the use of force report. Because the RBID report is a little bit different from the use of force report in the sense that it discusses a lot of the work that CAP has been doing. What we have right now in terms of disparity indices, et cetera, and then a future analysis plan in that respect. So it's separate from use of force, but at the same time, again, we're talking about similar things.
In the past, that
Yes.
analysis comes in the use of force report.
Yes.
So now it is taken out, it's sort of for us coming here and seeing that report, we want to see everything in one package, so we can discuss accordingly.
I can't speak to the release of that, but it is nevertheless.
So that was a management decision, and I think just to build upon what Daniel was saying, we wanted to do that with intentionality, so that we could really focus on the context piece, because under our board policy, we have a board policy and what we're prescribed to report on use of force itself. It doesn't really, it talks about the distribution of race, but it doesn't necessarily talk about the disparity. And we had everything in one report, and what we felt like we owed the community was to have a separate report, because we've heard time and time again that these numbers are coming out and what are you doing about it? So as opposed to having a 50-page report with a bunch of information, we want to make it content specific so that we could really focus in on the context of the actual disparities, disproportionalities, and then couple that with what is it that we're trying to do and give space to communicate what it is that we were trying to achieve with both our CAP and the work moving forward. And so, again, if the community has, a response to that as a collective, we can take that as management under advisement for future. The board, it is their report when we're reporting use of force. It is our report when we're reporting back our IBD findings. So again, we can reconsider that, but that's why we made the decisions in the now.
Okay, yeah, please.
Okay. I just wanted to say some of these things don't have to rely on any new knowledge. It has been known since 2020, and there's lots of research out there that affirms the impact of the kinds of reports that link race without explanation to violence, And that includes presenting a report that shows that calls to police for racialized groups results in violence, thereby communicating to people that I can call the police and say this person has a weapon, and it's more likely to introduce harm to them. That is a racist practice that is known and documented in research. The idea that we wouldn't change practices in response to that known condition is a complicity. Of course you're going to have to try to do something different. The reason you have conducted energy weapons is because there is a requirement out of recommendations, via reports, via inquiries, to do something different in terms of practice. I mean, we are trying to get different responses. Why are you collecting all the data for? The Anti-Racism Act's out of recognition of racism, to try and do something different so that we can know better to do better. I think some of that doesn't have to be recreated. You don't have to recreate the wheel to make those arguments. And you can change your responses. And that should be the goal, actually.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment. I'll pass it to...
Quick question.
Yes.
Because the majority of the use of force incidents originate from calls, I don't know, is it a rule or regulation for the 911 dispatch to ask to identify the race of the individual that the person is being complained about, or is it not in the practice at all, unless they mention it?
It's a description, basic description of the individual that's involved is asked. If race has come up as the description provided by the caller,
Okay.
then that is recorded in verbatim by the caller and dispatcher.
But the dispatch is not asking the individual.
Well, they'll ask for a description, and it's what the caller will provide.
I don't see any more questions. I'll pass it back for final remarks. Thank you.
So in the interest of time, it's 20 after 8 now. We recognize that you've taken the time out of your evening. We want to thank everybody that's come here to partake in this. If you've got any questions, we've got our survey up there. And for any information, I think all of you probably know how to get a hold of us, but certainly, the chief has offered up that if there's anything that needs to be sent our way to consider, we have, by the way of CAP, we have our information out there as well. So please don't hesitate to call us or reach out to us. We also have the QR code that we can use. So thank you so much for coming, sharing your evening with us. We look forward to hearing back for any questions, comments, or anything else. Thank you.
Just gonna add one last thing. If you are not receiving emails from myself, please connect with me. I can add you to our contact list. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.